Regulatory Standards Bill, first reading.
Honourable Rodney Hyde.
Mr Speaker, I move that the Regulatory Standards Bill be now read for a first time. At the appropriate time, Mr Speaker, I intend to move that the bill be referred to the Commerce Committee for their consideration. The Regulatory Standards Bill aims to improve the quality of regulation in New Zealand. As a government, we use our powers to regulate to ensure that people live safe lives, get treated fairly, protect the environment, to maintain a competitive and efficient economy, and much more. But regulation also imposes costs. Excessive regulation can impose unnecessary compliance costs on businesses and individuals, deter investment, and limit innovation and competition. Decade by decade, the quantity of regulation made in New Zealand has increased. Between 2000 and 2009, over 68,000 pages of legislation were passed. This equates to creating or amending around 105 acts and 405 regulations each and every year. Many of the countries we compete with have focused on improving the quality of their regulation with more success than New Zealand. New Zealand's ranking in the OECD Product Market Regulation Indicator has fallen from 4th in 1998 to 14th in 2008. As a small, isolated country, we need to do better if we want to be competitive in the global economy. Regulatory quality has been a strong focus for this government, as set out in its statement on regulation of August 2009. We have introduced a number of administrative measures designed to improve regulation as is made and to improve the stock of existing regulation. These measures include strengthened regulatory impact analysis requirements, a program of regulatory reviews, and a government-wide scan of the regulation on our legislative books. These measures have led to improvements in the quality of regulatory policy advice provided to ministers. The fact is, however, that administrative measures alone will never be enough to deliver the level of improvement that New Zealand so desperately needs. Only the Regulatory Standards Bill's more stringent requirements can bring about a change in the way governments think about regulation. The Regulatory Standards Bill has its origins in the Regulatory Responsibility Bill, which were introduced as a private member's bill in 2006. The Regulatory Responsibility Bill was examined and substantially revised by an expert regulatory responsibility task force established by the government in 2009. The Regulatory Standards Bill is a result of the work of that task force. I'd like to thank Dr Bryce Wilkinson, who first put forward the case for a Regulatory Responsibility Bill in his 2001 publication, Constraining Government Regulation. I'd also like to acknowledge Roger Kerr, Executive Director of the New Zealand Business Roundtable, for his tireless work in gaining support for this bill over the last 10 years. The Regulatory Standards Bill aims to increase the transparency of lawmaking and accountability of lawmakers. The bill has three key components. It provides a benchmark through a set of regulatory principles that all regulation should comply with. It provides transparency by requiring those proposing and creating regulation to certify whether the regulation is compatible with the principles. And it provides monitoring of the certification process through a new declaratory role of the courts. The bill identifies a set of principles of responsible regulation which all regulation should be consistent with. Regulation is defined, Mr Speaker, to include Acts of Parliament, statutory regulations, tertiary legislation, but excludes regulation made by local government. The principles are distilled from sources such as the Legislative Advisory Committee guidelines, the Common Law, and Parliament's own Regulations Review Committee. The principles cover 7 key areas, including the rule of law, protection of individual liberties, protection of property rights, taxes and charges, the role of the courts, review of administrative decisions, and, Mr Speaker, good law making. These principles are guides, not binding rules. From time to time, breaches of the principles will be necessary. The bill provides for this, and this is a key point. It allows Parliament to pass any legislation regardless of whether it complies with the principles. All that the bill requires is that departures from the principles are, quote, reasonable and demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. In order to encourage transparency about whether regulatory practices are consistent with the principles of responsible regulation, the bill imposes certification requirements on those who make regulation. Under the bill, chief executives and ministers responsible for proposed regulation must certify whether that regulation is consistent with the principles. Where regulation does not comply with one or more principles, the minister responsible must explain why that non-compliance is demonstrable, justifiable in a free and democratic society. If there is no minister responsible, as is the case with some tertiary legislation, the responsibility falls to the chief executive. Certification allows others to understand the impacts of proposed regulation and the trade-offs that we've had to make. We can and do have significant impacts on New Zealand businesses and New Zealanders when we use our regulatory powers. It is only right and proper that we should be open about the impacts that our proposed regulation will have. The Regulatory Standards Bill provides monitoring of the certification process by allowing the courts to provide declarations of incompatibility where they believe the principles have been breached. This power is declaratory only. It is only declaratory, Mr. Speaker. The courts will not have the power to strike down legislation, to issue injunctions against Parliament or the Crown, or to award damages to those adversely affected by regulation that is incompatible with the principles. Parliament, Mr. Speaker, you'll be pleased to learn, remains sovereign. The purpose of the declaratory function is to provide an independent, informed opinion on whether regulation complies with the principles. The function encourages ministers and chief executives to certify diligently and in good faith, as their certifications are liable to be tested in court. Initially, the courts would only be able to make declarations in relation to regulation made after the commencement of the bill. After 10 years, the declaratory power would extend to all regulation. In addition to its three key components of principles, certification and monitoring by the courts, the Regulatory Standards Bill requires the courts to prefer legislative interpretations that are consistent with the bill's principles. This provision initially applies only to new regulation, but after 10 years applies to the existing stock of regulation. The bill also requires every public entity to use its best endeavours to regularly review all regulation that it administers for compatibility with the principles. The steps entities have undertaken to review their regulation and the outcomes of the process must be included in the entity's annual reports. This bill, Mr. Speaker, provides us with better disciplines for creating and managing our regulation. It provides transparency in a similar way to the Public Finance Act. That Act imposes certain responsibilities on government spenders. It says if you're spending public money, justify it and be accountable for it. The Act has created a cultural shift in the way that money is spent in New Zealand and the whole mindset around public expenditure. The Regulatory Standards Bill places similar responsibilities on government regulators. It says if you're using the government's regulatory powers, justify it and be accountable for it. This transparency will result in a higher quality regulation that has fewer unintended consequences, it will reduce compliance costs, and that better achieves policy objectives. Mr. Speaker, I commend the Regulatory Standards Bill to the House.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. Honourable Leanne Dalziel.
Mr. Speaker.